for joining. We're gonna wait a couple seconds while this gets connected to YouTube. I think there's about a 15-second delay or something like that. Oh, great. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining. And we've got viewers on YouTube that are not part of the panel discussion, but they're watching the panel. And if questions come up from the panel, from the viewers on YouTube, Tutor is going to help us bring those questions into the conversation when appropriate. So we've sort of got two audiences here, the panel of all of us on the Zoom, and then whoever's watching as part of the LearningPlanet conference on YouTube. So you might be wondering a little bit what the Sound of Care panel is and why you've all been pulled together and why you've been asked to enter information into a tool you've never seen before. So let's just take 2 minutes at the beginning to give a little bit of background about the project. So I'm gonna introduce you to the members that are convening this panel, and then Nick will tell us a little bit about the goal, and then we'll just dive right into conversation. And my hope is throughout the conversation, things will become clearer and clearer as we go. So Lisa, would you like to go first and give an introduction?
Yeah, actually, Nick, I think you were going to give us the overview of the event.
Yeah, why don't, either way, Nick, why don't you go first? Give us an overview and tell us a little bit about yourself. You're on mute, by the way.
Second. Yeah, okay. Just, it's great to see everyone, and just a little bit of background about myself. My name's Nick Meehan. I'm the artistic director for an organization, Berlin-based organization called the Institute for Sound and Music, ISM, and we focus on the creation of installations and exhibitions, among other things, that are created in Berlin, designed to travel. Primarily focused on sound, immersive art, and electronic music are the themes. And really over the past year, there's been a focus from shifting our focus a bit, or evolving our focus a bit from purely aesthetic presentation to ways in which we can be a part of something that has impact. And that really leads us into this group that's assembled here today, and particularly the subset of us that have been working together for some time. We were brought together by, so Lisa, myself, Anne-Sophie, and Dave as well, and Olivier, and I'm not forgetting anyone. Brought together by for this group called Thinkers in Residence at the beginning of the pandemic, which was designed to focus on co-creation and experimentation, understanding ways in which we can work together through our respective initiatives and organizations to come up ways that can address things that have to do with climate. And this group in particular, the small subset, or the subset of us, we set out to focus on sound as an engagement tool. And we've all contributed ideas of our own, but really this is a good opportunity for us to hear from all of you who are working in coming from very different angles, but also have a lot probably to contribute over the next 90 minutes or so. I'll leave it at that. If I missed anything, maybe Lisa or Anne-Sophie or Dave, you can, or Olivier. Oh, one other thing I should say is the individual that brought us together, one of the key individuals that brought us together, I don't think is tuned in here, but is on YouTube, is Joanna Petkovics, who is a key member at Climate KIC, who without her, a lot of this would not have been possible. So thank you very much for being a part of this. I should say that. It's a pleasure to have you all here.
So Nick, thanks for the intro. And you mentioned a few other names, and I'm not going to do introductions of everybody that's on the panel, because that will come out in the conversation. But I do think the names you mentioned of the people that are sort of convening this, it's good to have a little bit of intro. So Lisa, why don't I come back to you?
Yeah, I'll just keep it brief so we can get on to the good stuff. I'm Lisa Robinson. I'm with BBC Media Action, and that is the BBC's international development charity. So our work looks to use media and communication for impact, really, with audiences in Africa, Asia, Middle East, Eastern Europe. So sound is part of what we do, and I'm really interested to hear a bit more about from all of you about how we might think about that carefully within our work. Thanks.
Thanks. And Sophie?
Hi all, it's a pleasure to see so many people today. So I'm Sofie Norn. I'm a curator at the Museum for the United Nations UN Life. UN Life is a new institution, creative institution, which mission it is to dramatically increase the number of people taking action on the United Nations global goals and mobilizing 1 billion people over the next 10 years. And we do that by working through culture and unleashing the power of culture globally. And the reason why we do that is that we believe that through culture, we can touch people where they are mentally and physically, through their passions, and on the merits of their everyday life. So culture is really the lever of change that we are working with, and we are increasingly exploring different ways to use culture very specifically with different communities, with different cultural strands as a tool for engagement. Yeah, so I'm very excited to hear the discussion unfolding today and learn more. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Anne-Sophie. Olivier, we didn't know if we'd be able to get you today because you're organizing everything else, but since you're here, you want to do just a few seconds of introduction?
Very briefly too, thank you all for being here. I'm working at the Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity in Paris. We're working on a program called, I'm one of the directors of a program called the LearningPlanet, and we're doing a LearningPlanet festival. LearningPlanet is a kind of middle ground, working with social entrepreneurs, scientists, educators, more and more with artists too, but with hundreds and thousands of artists joining in order to create plenty of different programs around the world and connecting many of the learning communities around the world in order to help learn to take care of oneself, others, and the planet. And this is a little bit why, but the subject today is the sound of care, because this idea of caring is very important to us. So on International Day of Education today, we are doing this big worldwide event with something like 500 organizations and networks, from UNESCO and UNICEF to Ashoka and many others, Catalyst 2030, CAN, Community Health Network. So we're very pleased to have you with us today, and I won't speak anymore, and we'll be listening to your exchanges. Thank you very much again.
Great. Well, I'm going to shift back to gallery view. I think that will change. It'll allow the people watching on YouTube to see all the panelists. And the next 80 minutes is really about all of you, about the panelists. And my job, my name is Dave King, by the way, and my job is just to try and facilitate a conversation where hopefully we get all of the rich and diverse ideas that are in your head kind of out onto the virtual table, so to speak, so that we can see them and hear them and play with them together. One way to look at the panel is like this, is to look at everybody's faces, but another way to look at the panel is like this. So I'm going to share my screen. And for the people watching on YouTube who weren't involved in any of the prep, each person prior to the panel has put in some examples of sound that they feel led to action in some way, and then characterized that example through a couple different dimensions: the action dimension, the feeling dimension in yellow, and the characteristics of that sound that they think maybe made it so impactful. And one of the things we can start to see here are a lot of commonality in some of the concepts. Empathy being a big feeling that's in common. Connection. In terms of characteristics, connection to a movement. Also this idea of connection and shared experience. And some of the actions, changing people's perspectives. Healing, this is part of sound of care, so it was nice to see healing come up. collaboration, listening, learning, protest. And what we'd like to do now is start to hear from the panelists about these concepts. And I'm going to show a slightly simpler view of this, where we start just by looking at the actions. And it'll take a little while for you all to get used to this kind of mode of conversation, but bear with me, and after a few minutes, I think you'll find it pretty intuitive. The easiest way to start is to find the biggest node in common, like participation, and to hear from some of you that provided examples where you said that the action that this led to was participation. So I'm just going to pick one here. So this example, Canto Agua, Raphael,
yes.
do you want to tell us a little bit about this, but particularly when you say it led to participation, what do you mean?
So first, thanks everyone. First of all, thanks for the invitation to Sound of Care. Definitely and profoundly touched by the name of this panel. I am part of the Voz Terra Collective, a sound and arts music collective based in Bogota. And we decided to share with you this, this project, which is part of a larger initiative of one of the members of the collective, Hector Buitrago, who is a musician here in Colombia, Latin America, a well-known musician. And he has been working with other organizations along Colombia and different countries in this initiative called Canto Agua, which translates into Singing to Water. And Singing to Water, Canto Agua invites citizens and people from different communities into getting close to water, getting close to singing, and being able to express gratitude and to participate into this collective experience of singing to water, into recognizing water as the bottom base component of life on Earth, and that to remind us through singing and through creating rituals around water and territory as a vehicle into recognizing the sacred nature of our of water and community. So the Canto Agua community, they gather and invite other people, different people from several communities, and they create different rituals in along rivers, streams, the sea, and other places where water is present. Is presented. So participation here is very important because it's like a collective experience where people who are not necessarily musicians join these rituals and participate into expressing their deep gratitude, or even asking for forgiveness for whatever we have been doing to water sources, and but also and I think personally most importantly is recognizing our water nature that is present in outside and inside every one of us.
Thanks. So this is one view of participation, and one of the things I'm hoping to do in the conversation is explore how sometimes we might use the same words but mean different things, and sometimes we might use different words and mean the same thing. So let's look at other people that linked their examples to participation. David, you have 3 examples that are all linked to participation. So clearly, this was an important sort of form of action for you. Raphael talked about participation in terms of sort of ritual and shared experience of water. What does participation mean to you in these examples?
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'll be switching on and off between the camera because I'm recovering from a cold and I don't want to feel awkward blowing my nose in your faces. So I'll be switching off and on the camera.
It's about sound. The panel's about sound. So if you blow your nose, just do it very loudly.
It might give a different reaction to participation than you want. So I work for BBC Media Action. I work in East Africa, in Kenya, and we are currently implementing a climate change project. And one of the ways where we have used sound to to bring out participation among our audiences is, for example, one of the videos, one of the audio clips that we produced in a feature was an old man who was crying that he's lost his camel, and the sound of an old man crying and wailing elicited participation in that. It created a sense of the audiences were so touched that the action that led after that was that people demanded for accountability, and so the government had to act, and they started talking about how they can compensate and how they can be providing insurance for pastoralists once there is a drought or a flood. And so that's a kind of citizen participation that the sound of a man crying over the death of his camel, which is his livelihood, elicited during one of the projects that we were doing.
Wow, this is, one of the things I like about my job is I never know where the questions I ask are going to go. And it's a great example of going from participation to accountability, but also you mentioned sort of asking the government to make some changes. Did that lead to any changes at a policy level?
Yes, it's almost a semi-policy level, because the government now offers to compensate for loss in terms of for loss of animals, and they also created an awareness program where if the drought is going to be too much, there is education. The community is educated on the need to what they call destock, where you sell your livestock and you get money. Then after the drought is over, you're able to buy back some animals, which is not really a policy, but it's an action. It's a government action.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think I clicked on policy change to see if there were other people that had examples of sound leading to what they considered policy action. And there were some others. So maybe we can hear from Leah or Grant or Naomi or Christian. Any of you want to share maybe the example that you brought in that led to policy change? I see Grant messing with audio, so I'm going to call on you, Grant, if you don't mind. So I think you connected policy change to whales. You want to tell us what you mean?
Yeah, for sure. I just my connection just dropped, so I just had a big aporia there. I apologize. I'm
quite putting you on the spot then. So just
no, it's cool. It's cool. I mean,
yeah.
The whales thing. The whales thing I thought was very well known. So the Paynes sort of discovered this song of whales, very crudely put, and then those sounds were sort of disseminated beyond the scientific community. So they became quite well known, and I think at the time they were very they were a huge surprise to people, and by all accounts they fed directly into strengthening pressure to protect whales effectively. And I guess there was it was really sort of a game changer, presence of these vocalizations.
Naomi, how is that similar or different than the example you gave that you linked to policy change, hearing after extinction?
The piece here that I'm referring to is a piece by artist and anthropologist Lena Zeb, Sonic Extinction, Memory and Breakdown. But I kind of took her piece as an example or a broader sort of set of tendencies, which is of making field recordings and then creating compositions out of field recordings to show the effects of environmental change, especially the effects of industrialization, longer term anthropogenic climate change on ecosystems and on the biodiversity of those ecosystems, and how it's possible through making field recordings to trace processes that are making species extinct or displacing, perhaps on a smaller scale, their patterns of migration that might lead ultimately to their extinction. And so in this area, and it's certainly by no means limited to Lena's work, but to lots of other people, including on this panel, who've done work in this area. But we are seeing some policy change or some recognition in response to work like this, especially from local government interacting with the third sector, where there is actually quite an awareness of work on the sound study side of things, and people reacting to that. It's, I think, the strength of sound here is it's something that can be communicated, for instance, to school groups visiting a wetlands site or something like that. So it's quite hands-on and accessible to the public, and also to a younger generation who are, increasingly anxious, and so they should be, about the effects of climate change.
You're starting to get at, I think, what we're hoping to uncover in this panel is not just that sound can lead to action like a policy change, but I think what we're trying to understand is how does that happen? What are the mechanisms of sound that might make it so? And Christian, you've got an example here that you said was related to policy change. You want to tell us a little bit about it and why you think it was successful in leading to policy change?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's really, it's a musical example, but it's also a dance. I mean, the Toi Toi is a dance from the South African freedom struggle. Very intensive collective dancing accompanied by singing and drumming. And it's a reminder that sound is usually bound up with some kind of cultural human practice, musical or otherwise. And music is also, as a cultural human practice, incorporates other dimensions like dancing as well. So this is really, I think it is a musical example in a way. So it is a sound example as well, even though it's considered a dance primarily. And what it really is a way to mobilize these masses of demonstrators in the face of a power that they couldn't really compete with when it came to just the amount of force that was there, because they were in the face of the army or police with heavy weapons. But when you look at pictures, when you look at videos from Toi Toi demonstrations, you can see how just this mass of people moving together, coordinated by music and the dance, is just such a powerful, creates such a powerful image and such a powerful a movement, really. I mean, it's not just a physical movement, but it is an actual social movement that's embodied in these dancing people. And it must have been extremely impressive and also extremely frightening to the soldiers standing there with their machine guns, being approached by these masses who were peacefully demonstrating, but who are using the Toi Toi as a way to demonstrate their power, to coordinate their power and to demonstrate their power. So I think this is it's a really good example of how music and musical practice can sort of not just bring people together, coordinate them, and create a show of power as well, besides creating actual power.
Thanks. And it's, I'm seeing in the chat some Diana saying she's loving these examples, which is good. My hope is as we talk more about these, we won't just talk about the examples that each people offered, but we'll start to find ways that maybe the combination of examples illuminates something a little bit deeper. Bernie, I know that you came in a little bit later to the system. I didn't get your email till late, so I don't have links from your examples yet, but I think that they're also related to social action and potentially policy change. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Dave, and thanks for hosting this. This is a wonderful opportunity to tie together all of these issues around sound. My background is in music, and just to give people a little idea, since I wasn't able to get material up on the page there. At some point I quit music as a professional studio musician and went into bioacoustics. And I worked with Roger Payne's group, originally studying whales and whale vocalization, and finally switched to terrestrial work. And I've got several examples which I can show if I can share a screen.
Well, you know, I uploaded them. So if there's one that you want me to play, I think I can do that for you.
Put anyone up, Dave, on the screen, okay. And I'll try to walk people through what we're listening to.
Well, pick a one that you think's most applicable. Coral Reef, Sugarloaf, Lincoln.
Well, they're all different. They speak to different issues, and they're only well, 2 minutes total.
I'll pick then.
Okay. That's Coral Reef. Okay, what we're describing here is the sound of a coral. No, stop it, please.
Oh, sorry.
What we're describing here is the sound of a coral reef that's living. This is in Vanuatu in Fiji. And you can see that the very bottom of the screen, this is a spectrogram, a graphic illustration of sound. We can now illustrate what sound looks like in a habitat. And we can show the niches that these critters, each of these critters establishes for itself. It establishes its own bandwidth. And what you see at the bottom of the page here, just at the very bottom, maybe the 10% of the bottom, is the surface noise at the top of and on the ocean, the surface noise. And then the rest of it, about 90% of the screen, from the very top to where the ocean surface noise is, are fish. There are 11 species of fish here, and this is divided into two areas. One on the left is 15 seconds of a living, healthy reef, and on the right is the same reef, about 400 meters away, and you can see that it's beginning to die, and with it, the sound is dying as well. Now we can play it and show. The static are fish, 11 different species of coral fish. Now watch what happens in the dying reef. The few sounds that you hear are snapping shrimp or pistol shrimp. So in 30 seconds, we can explain the difference between a living and a dying reef. Now this is in a marine habitat. Can we go to another one? Any one of the Sugarloaf State Park is a good one. You can do that.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a 1-minute example which shows the effects of global warming. And you'll see at the very bottom of the screen where it says 2004, that's the signature of a stream running through that meadow there. And above that, just above that, the middle third of the spectrogram is these are examples of birds. And these are birds, and there are 4 different examples here, each 15 seconds long. The first is 2004, the next one to the right is 2009, 2014, and 2015. And we're showing the progressive effects of a drought here. In 2004, this was a normal year. And you can see in the middle of the spectrogram is density and diversity of birds, which are common in that area. 2009, to the right of that, you can see that the density and diversity is beginning to fall off now. And that's a result of global warming, where spring is occurring now in that habitat 2 weeks earlier. To the right of that is 2014, which is the third year of a major drought here in California, which is still ongoing. And you can see that most of the stream is gone, most of the birds have disappeared, density and diversity. And then to the right of that is an almost black screen. No stream, no birds. Silent Spring. First time I've ever heard of Silent Spring. Play it. This is a normal year. Density and diversity beginning to change because of global warming. Spring occurring earlier now. Third year of a major drought. Almost no stream, very few birds. In 2015, major drought effects. No stream, very few birds. Silent Spring. Yeah. And 2 years later, for the last 3 years, it's been burning because of the fires in California. So that's the story. That's the story in 1 minute. It's shown by sound, and it has to do with every aspect of this thing that we're talking about now.
Yeah, I found this to be a compelling example, and I certainly had feelings while listening to it, and it's actually a really nice segue into starting to talk not just about the actions that maybe sound has been able to drive, but the why. Why is sound able to drive these actions? And so if I come back to our more colorful network.
Can I answer that question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
These soundscapes, these biophonies, are a narrative of place. They tell us how healthy a habitat is, and they give us a lot of information. These biophonies are the basis of our music. They're the basis of our language. And they have all, this is a keystone expression of what is happening in our natural world.
So, I mean, this is great. And Michael, if you're on, you selected one of Bernie's examples as one of your sound examples. So it's kind of a nice segue. And you want to tell us a little bit about maybe why you picked it and why you think it works. You put in words like emotion and curiosity and wonder. Yeah, tell us about that.
Yes, thank you, Dave. And hi, everybody. It's great to be with you all. And so my name is Michael John, and I'm based in Munich, running a place called Biotopia. And I experienced Bernie's Great Animal Orchestra when it was installed in Paris in the Fondation Cartier. And it was an incredible immersive experience. I'm sure many people also experienced it. And that actually was, for me, remarkable, because you could see the way people would dive into this and spend, sometimes an hour or 2 hours just absorbed in these different soundscapes. And that actually inspired us to invite Bernie over to the foothills of the Alps here, and to have a masterclass with artists and scientists, which Biotopia organized with this foundation called the Art and Nature Foundation. And this was something which happened in 2019. And then we, inspired by this experience, we actually, in 2020, when the pandemic happened, we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to give more people this experience of going out and making recordings of the dawn chorus of the birds in people under lockdown conditions. And we wanted to really share this experience that we had as a small group with Bernie. So in a very short time, in a couple of weeks, we created a platform called the Dawn Chorus platform. Maybe you're able to, do you see the sound there called Dawn Chorus Project? The other one, if you can open that up, you should be able to, if you click on that link. So this was something that started in May of last year, and we were really surprised by the response. So we had thousands of people from all over the world sharing their local Dawn chorus, and I think for people it was an emotional experience. Many of these people were not normally people who would know about their local bird wildlife, and they suddenly, from their balconies or from their windows, they were actually out recording bird species, not only birds, also frogs, sheep, monkeys, other creatures. And it created this connection. People also wrote to us about birds that they'd heard that they never knew were in their area. And of course, there was this amazing condition where one had hardly any airplanes in the sky, hardly any cars on the roads. So a lack of anthropogenic noise in the background. And for us, this was something which it generated emotion, but it was also participation. And we were interested in this as a project for citizen science and arts. So bringing together citizen scientists, people monitoring biodiversity in their area, but also involving people engaging with the data artistically. And that's a project really inspired by Bernie Krause's work, which we're looking to bring forward now.
You know, in both these examples, I find myself thinking about changed perspective, which is something, you know, in Bernie's example of the reef, it really struck me, and the analogy between the reef sort of going quiet and our pandemic work, you know, our pre and post pandemic world getting quieter was sort of striking. Leah, I noticed that you also had some examples connected to change perspective, and I think you may have some thoughts on what you're hearing so far.
Absolutely, yeah. Firstly, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's been a really fascinating conversation so far, and yeah, such a great collection of people that's been brought together. So yes, I mean, both of the examples that I mentioned, I think, do have that potential impact. I mean, one of the examples there, the Glastonbury Ocean Soundscape, isn't one of my pieces. It's a piece by Chris Watson, you know, very high profile composer, sound artist, field recordist, who is very well known for doing a lot of the sound on David Attenborough's documentaries. And, you know, Chris is particularly well known for his underwater recordings, his hydrophone recordings. And I thought this was such a fascinating example because it was a piece that he composed based on a lot of the material from Attenborough documentaries. And it was actually played or premiered on one of the main stages at the Glastonbury Festival in 2019, just before David Attenborough's address. And it sort of describes this journey from Antarctica to the Arctic, and it brought these hydrophone recordings, these underwater sound world, you know, to the main stage of this major music festival where the audience wasn't expecting it. And, you know, there was a lot of conversations generated on social media, and I thought it's just a really fascinating example that, you know, it was able to attract this mainstream audience, much like in the way Bernie's incredible work does as well. But, you know, we often don't think of these underwater environments, oceans, rivers, as acoustic environments. But I mean, that couldn't be further from the truth. These are full of sound, you know, and dynamic, incredible soundscapes and, you know, marine life that literally live in this world of sound and vibration that are reliant on sound to communicate and survive. So I'm always really fascinated about ways that we can bring this awareness to a wider audience. And I think that Glastonbury Ocean Soundscape, you know, was such a great example of being able to generate, you know, a huge conversation at the festival itself, but online as well, and the distribution of that soundscape afterwards and the kind of impact it had with continuing this conversation about the importance of sound in aquatic environments. And, you know, that very much builds on what Grant mentioned earlier with the Payne's examples of the whale recordings, of course, and naturally Bernie's example with that powerful contrast between the coral reef recordings. And that very much relates to the other example I had there as well, migration patterns, which is one of my installations, which is sort of part of a larger project called Biosphere Soundscapes in collaboration with UNESCO, and that's based on field recordings off the east coast of Australia. So with a particular focus around Gari, Fraser Island, which is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, and of course the Great Barrier Reef. And so it's hydrophone recordings, underwater recordings over the last 10 years. And there's multiple examples in those recordings where it is, you know, essentially documenting ocean acidification and the death of the Great Barrier Reef. So you can hear those very dramatic contrasts match in the same way that you could hear in the example that Bernie played as well. And, you know, on one hand, these recordings are being used for biodiversity monitoring. You know, we are using these recordings for scientific purposes, obviously writing papers about what's being discovered and, you know, using this sound as much as we can in a, you know, in a policy change context where possible as well, particularly when we're talking about issues such as seismic testing along the east coast of Australia. But, you know, for me, most importantly, I think these listening experiences, particularly with aquatic soundscapes, you know, can create this connection and this environmental empathy that is missing from so many of these climate action conversations. You know, it's such a powerful experience for someone to be immersed in these aquatic ecosystems and truly understand how sound can function underwater and, you know, feel connected to this, you know, truly acoustic environment.
This, you know, it's fascinating to hear all these thoughts. And what I'd like to do is to take 1 minute to engage our group of conveners, Anne-Sophie, Lisa, Nick, and Olivier. You know, part of the reason for this panel is to help inform the work that they're doing. And some of them may have some thoughts. And so that's a heads up to you guys. I'm gonna ask you a question in a second. And then we've been focused on some of the sort of common nodes that are in the middle, but we also have some interesting ones that are on the outside, like innovation and play. And so after I bring the conversation a little bit to our kind of steering committee, I'm gonna then bring it back to the periphery of some of our concepts. So, and that will allow us to hear from the people that we haven't heard from yet. And then we'll see if we can start to merge these ideas together. So firstly, Olivier or Anne-Sophie, Nick or Lisa, anything that stands out to you in the conversation so far?
I'm the last example, and then just also, you know, I think we were talking about participation. This is always something that resonates with me. You know, there was one that you highlighted at the beginning, Dave, that was shared experience, and I'm kind of curious as well what projects are kind of, or interests are convening around that idea. But yeah, so far it's just been a really nice kind of trajectory to follow through a lot of these thoughts from my perspective.
Olivier?
Very quickly, I have a team of scientists not far away from me and different students in different fields, and everyone is fascinated by the conversation. So I don't want to take more time than this, but the idea of citizen science, which is something that we are very keen on, and how do we do big citizen science programs and extreme citizen science programs around sound will be something that we definitely want to go further afterwards. But I would like to leave the floor to the panelists we haven't heard of yet, and if Anne-Sophie wants to say something, or Lisa. But thank you very much. It's very exciting for the time being.
Anne-Sophie or Lisa?
So it's so inspiring to hear all these thoughts and how they're relating and kind of travel through your different projects. So thank you so much for jumping into this with us. One of the things that keeps coming to me is this it's a question around the power of a changed perspective. And I'm thinking about what makes many of these projects alike is that they somehow have augmented a reality, or they have put the people who have perceived them in a somewhat different situation than they would otherwise be in, or the projects have taken the sound to another space than they otherwise wouldn't have been in. And this kind of the intersection of maybe unexpected spaces and where you experience something can be a very powerful tool to make people hear something or sense something for the first time. And here you talked about this, the empathy that you create by creating these projects. And yeah, I think that is one of the thoughts that I have right now. It's the thought around, or the question around change perspective and augmentation of spaces for audiences.
So this is where I'd like to steer us next, is to try and get to the how. Right now we've been talking, I think, some of the what, what are the sounds and what are the actions. But I'd like to start to dive into your views on how that's achieved. And so, and Sophie just mentioned this changing of perspective by, creating a different space in which people can see things differently. And Julian, I think that this idea of space is something that I sort of took away from the way you described the mood sonic example. Any thoughts you have so far on this, and maybe not just about the sound itself, but what you think is leading towards people having some kind of changed perspective?
Yes, thank you very much. Nice to be here and fascinating listening to everyone. I think we've been talking almost exclusively about sound outdoors, and it's important to realize that in the Western world, we spend 93% of our lives indoors, about 6% in the car, the other 80% inside buildings. And those of you who might have seen my fourth TED Talk, that was a plea to architects to start designing with their ears as well as with their eyes, because most of the built space is designed purely visually, and a lot of it sounds terrible. It's not fit for purpose, education, healthcare, and indeed offices. So at the Sound Agency, we've kind of tried to address that. We launched a product just as COVID hit, which was beautiful timing. And it is a set of biophilic generative soundscapes. So I need to explain those two words. Biophilic is kind of simply described as bringing the outdoors indoors. And what one hopes is that by doing that, we can reduce the sterility of indoor environments and regain that connection with nature, which gets lost so much as people commute from, concrete apartments to concrete offices in urban environments. So biophilia is for the eyes, it can be for the nose, it can be for haptics as well, but in our case, it's sound. Generative sound is created live algorithmically by a computer. So it's not a recording, or it's a synthesis of lots of recordings, but it happens pretty much like sound happens in a forest. The birds don't all sing at once and then fall silent. There's a random stochastic distribution, and we can achieve that with computers now. So these are the soundscapes we're designing, and we are getting, I have to say, joyfully, some really good traction with some major organizations. We've got installations in Australia, America, Europe, and the initial feedback from the people who are experiencing this sound is phenomenal. We're getting satisfaction ratings of over 90%, which we did not expect. No kind of pushback. It's very important to involve people in design, just in the same way as you would with anything. If you impose anything on a group of people, they will kick back. So we have ways in which people can influence. We have journeys through different soundscapes. In Australia, I don't know, Leah might know this place, Rottnest Island is a place that we've sonified. There are lots of different habitats on it, and we've delivered those into an office nearby so people can move their location according to the time of day, how they feel, what they're doing. So it's a kind of involving people in creating an environment which enhances well-being, because I'm sure everybody on this panel knows the research about birdsong, about water, about natural sound and well-being. It's good for us. Wind, water, birds, very beneficial in almost every way. Not all of those sounds, obviously howling Arctic gales or corvids may not be your thing, but the more pleasant aspects of those sounds are very, very good for us. And also, of course, it can be productive because we're masking unwanted speech. Water is very good at doing that and far healthier than the kind of filtered artificial noise that typically is put into offices to mask conversation. So we're looking at a huge change here for millions and millions of people. Noise is the biggest problem in the built environment, in workspaces anyway, and possibly in a lot of people's homes. And we're trying to address that with designed sound. And once you start designing sound, you're becoming conscious, you're becoming intentional, you're creating a link. You know, we've gone numb for years. It's what I bang on about on conference stages all over the world. People have gone numb, they're not listening because there's so much noise, because we're in this insane world of always on, multiple input, intensity, you know, addiction to more. We need to reconnect with nature inside as well as outside. So we hope very much that this kind of initiative is going to change people's connection with nature and make them more sensitive, so that all of the things that people have been talking about here, the appalling effects of what we're doing as human beings on the species, the rates of catastrophic die-off of lots and lots of species, the things Bernie and others have been cataloging, hopefully we can start to sensitize people as they start to appreciate the importance of natural sound, even indoors.
Thank you. You know, there's two things you said there that I want to try and pick up on and use that as a way to hear from. I think there's just a few people we haven't heard from yet. And then see if we can meld some of these thoughts together. So you talked about connection, which is why I have it highlighted here. You can see that's a very common feeling that people identified with their sound examples. And you also talked about designed sound. And I think one of the questions I want to really drive towards in the second half of the panel is, can we design sound for action, for engagement? Or can we design sound experience for action and engagement? You might not be designing the sound, you might be designing the way people experience the sound. But I like what you talked about in terms of having, you know, intentionality in terms of what you're trying to achieve through that experience. And I also like that you brought in this idea of connection, connecting to people, in this case, connecting to people, you know, in lots of ways, but also at their workplace. Frederic, I think, you know, you have a physical movement component to some of your examples. It seems to me that this is also a way that you try and drive connection. Is that something you could maybe talk about?
Sure. Hi everyone. Thanks for an invitation. I think this panel is really very, very interesting. Yeah, so I'm a researcher, and what I'm trying to do is actually design the interaction between body movement and sound. So that could be a system where by capturing your movement, you can trigger and modify the sound. And that's a very interesting way to listen differently, and sometimes I call that embodied listening, where you try to connect the sound with your body and movement. And to be maybe a bit less abstract, what we do is different things. First, it could be artistic work, and I put an example of we developed with the composer Michel-Agnès Magalès, where we try to design experience with public, where it's concert with the participation of the audience. So we ask the people to move, and they would experience the sound by their movement. we also do some education action where we ask the student to move, and it's a different way to listen to sound and to create sound and music. And a final example I haven't put in one of the examples, but I think it's quite interesting because we're also working on application for rehabilitation and physical rehabilitation, where people have to do motion, and then we link their movements with sound interactively, and that's helping or motivating people to move. And quite interestingly, we have been using a lot of sound from the environment. And as it was said before, the sound from the environment works very well for rehabilitation or for people. They could imagine action and could imagine spaces by listening to this type of sound.
I clicked on Physicality and saw that connected us to Diana, who I don't think we've heard from yet. And so, Diana, your sort of characteristics of physicality and the examples you provided, are they similar or different from what Frederic is describing?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I imagine there's a yes and here. Mm-hmm. As I'm struck by the power of connection between all of the participants and the examples given, and how we define our terms of experience and quality that, you know, could be redefined in ways that connect us differently. So physicality might mean literally a physical experience of music, but it also might mean metaphorically what we embody and what we want to see embodied. With the examples that I was looking at, they were very different experiences of physicality. One was the sound of children's laughter that we hear from playgrounds, which I remember a colleague saying to me decades ago, you know, it sounds the same in any language, in any culture. When you hear children playing, it's that same frequency. It makes me think of the sound of water having that same frequency everywhere we hear it. And the physicality of that experience of sound creates this sense of joy and gratitude and playfulness that connects us with that quite universal experience. The second example I gave resonates for me with some of the examples I heard around quiet and diminished sound, or listening to the absence of sound when it is removed or altered in a physical space, as was the case in specifically New York City in the early crisis of the COVID-19 epidemic, a center in New York, where the sounds were removed from that urban soundscape, and they were punctuated with sirens. So that sound was eerie and a piercing awakening. And I do think it connected with people's behavior to retreat, to withdraw, or to reach out and help. And the other sound of that time that was, I think, an activator of how we embody the physical experience of music was this outpouring of sound of support that people would generate at 7 p.m. every evening when first responders and frontline workers would come home, and people go out on their, you know, we saw this all over the world, people going out on their balconies, people going on their front doors, on their stoops, in their space, wherever they were confined, and banging pots and pans or cheers or musical instruments, that outpouring of a human roar of compassion and generosity and gratitude was really powerful. And then finally, the physicality of an international art installation I'm developing now, also called Constellation, which I love that there's also that kind of connection between us with Frederic's example, is looking at what vibrational frequencies that maybe we'll learn from spectrographic presentations correspond most directly with not just overall human wellness, but specifically the sense of awe, and how we generate and create a sense of awe in our species, that we know when we enter those states physiologically enhances and expands our experience of generosity, of connectedness, of compassion, and wanting to augment that by introducing that globally through a connected art installation that uses augmented reality so that we can enhance the physical reality of how we're experiencing each other today.
Wow, there's a lot of different threads there, and I'm wondering if Lukas has any thoughts on this, because, you know, Lukas, I find the examples that you provided to touch in different ways on a number of the different threads that have come up. You have you put in an example of climate data sonification, which strikes me in certain ways similar to Bernie's example of the living reef and dying reef. But you've also put in an example of music during lockdown, or which helps us understand quiet and music and memory, which gets to wonder, which feels connected to that sense of awe Diana was just talking about. Thoughts about what you've heard so far, and maybe specifically, let's try and drive a little bit to the why and not just the what. The examples you've given that are impactful, because you've got a very wide variety of them, why do you think they're so impactful?
Well, first, thanks for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here with you. And I'm based in Berlin. My background is maybe a bit different than all of yours, or like most of yours. I work in public policy, or like advise on public policy for music. So I think my examples are quite different. And so maybe I'm going to start. I mean, I think what ties them together is, I think they all, you know, all appeal on a very emotional level and connect on an emotional level. And that's, I think, overall, that's the unique, you know, the unique feature of music, that it can do that. And so the example, maybe I want to tie into what Diana said about, you know, how we experienced music during the lockdown, because I think it's quite an interesting example. I mean, I sent in the videos, you know, of, I think it was in March when you saw in Italy a lot of people singing and making music from their balconies, and I think it, you know, it created this sense of belonging in a time when everything was governed by like anxiety, and I think it's interesting because typically, you know, if we would hear people making music on their balconies, it would be something that I think we might call the police for. But I think the key here is that suddenly the context changed. And I think people also realized, I think for a big part of the pandemic, people realized, you know, or reevaluated their relationship to music and also sound, because suddenly their experience was so different, either because it was lacking, or in terms of, like, you know, experiencing music, or because there was the soundscape in the city completely changed because there was no traffic. So I think it's interesting to see in that perspective of the context that changed, and that completely changed people's perception. And I think, you know, with this example, we still don't know what this will lead to, and we still don't know how this will affect the way people experience and value music and sound. But I do believe that it has changed people's perspective already. The question is, how quickly will it change back after the pandemic? I am hopeful, but yeah, I think that's kind of summarizing a little bit all of them and giving one example.
You know, you talked about the music during the lockdown and the shared experience, but a lot of the examples we've been giving, when we talk about the emotion behind it, because you talked about emotion, we've talked a lot about positive emotions. And I'm struck by, you know, a few terms that came in here that were not positive emotions: unease, anger. I think these are connected to some examples that Naomi gave. Naomi, maybe do you want to take a minute to talk about any thoughts on the role of negative emotion when listening to sound in terms of creating action?
Sure, of course, and I'm really enjoying this. This is an incredible conversation. I think I'm already wishing it could go on for many more hours, longer than we have available. So thank you to everyone else. I think one thing I would just say is I don't think anger is a negative emotion. I think it's an incredibly positive emotion. It's often seen as a secondary emotion that comes to defend against more vulnerable emotions, such as sadness or rejection or abandonment, loneliness, those kinds of things. But we also know that anger is something psychologically we shouldn't ignore, because it's a spur to action. It's an indication that we need to do something, that something isn't right in the world as it is, and that we need to act. But it also powerfully brings people together. And this can be for better or for worse. I'm not suggesting it has an unalloyed positive effect, but that as an emotion, it's absolutely essential for large-scale global change, for increased social and environmental justice. And I think, you know, maybe I notice this a lot more because a lot of my field work has been in situations where anger is often the primary emotion that is palpable audibly. I started off doing work initially when I was field recording, tracing how we can hear the sounds of precarity in urban neighborhoods, particularly in the Parisian banlieue. And this project, you know, quickly morphed into something that became, at least in part, a study of protest sound, because it was impossible to understand these conditions without also understanding occupations of public space, marches, demonstrations, occupations, and so on. And you know, I think we can see here how anger, you know, is incredibly powerful at bringing people together, getting people to see around themselves in a much broader dimension. But it also ties in with, I think, a sense of, in the chat, some conversations developing around sort of the absence or muting or silencing of sound. And I think it's very important we distinguish between all these modalities. It's not just simply presence and absence of sound, but that anger can often come as a response to a lack of being heard, an inaudibility, and a sense of anger can be a spur to making noise, as I'm sure many of us who have any sense of a temper in us will know that, you know, we want to raise our voices, and collectively this is like what people do in the streets, and it's often on behalf of those whose voices are marginalized, or on behalf of the environment or of species that don't have that power of human representation in the same way.
So it's interesting to me that in the discussion, there's been a discussion about silence, you know, versus sound, and the challenge of not having the right, the way I interpret some of what's going on in the discussion is the challenge of not having the right words to describe silence, the different types of silence, you know, having one word silence sort of doesn't do it justice. And as we were just now talking about anger, you know, I think part of what you were getting at is one word maybe doesn't do that justice. There's different types of anger. And, you know, what I'd like to do now is actually turn off the screen share for a second, which is all about words. You were all sort of forced to, take these concepts of the sound that you really cared about, and you were sort of forced to put it into some very imperfect words. You had to pick a word like anger or silence or connection, when I'm sure the reality is far more nuanced. And so the question I might ask the group now is, what are the things that we don't have the right words for when it comes to generating action from sound? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Bernie, please.
Mute here. Okay. Yeah, there is sound, there is noise, there is silence. I just posted on chat the idea that Chris Watson came up with. We were having that discussion once when we were on a panel together in the UK, and we were talking about silence, and Chris said something very interesting. He said, really, silence means no sound. And there is no environment which has living organisms in it, whether it's marine or terrestrial, that is silent. It just doesn't exist. But what Chris Watson said was that there are environments which are tranquil. So he exchanged the word tranquility for silence. And I think as I've been thinking about it over the last few years since I first heard that, I think he's probably onto something there. And it's the same thing with noise. How do you distinguish noise from sound? So these are major issues in the language that we need to address.
Other thoughts?
Yes,
Raphael,
I think,
please.
If I may just say, anybody who's been in an anechoic chamber knows that silence, if you get close to that, and you can't even in there because you start to hear the blood pumping through your ears and so forth, it's not a comfortable place to be. Tranquil is beautiful. The silence is quite threatening. Ultimately, silence is the sound of death, isn't it? You only get in space when there is no life. If there's no vibration, that's death. And so that is a powerful concept, although it's the baseline for all sound. We do mean tranquility when we talk about silence between the notes. It's the thing that gives us meaning to a degree. The gaps between the words define our comprehension. The gaps between the notes define music. If you don't have silences or tranquil gaps, there is no meaning. However, silence in its purest form, that's death.
Raphael, I think you had a thought on this as well.
Yeah, this made me think about something we talk a lot within the work we do with the collective, with the field recordings, with writing guides for teachers and students in relation to listening to nature sounds, and creating meditations. And it's this idea of before thinking about taking action, we need to stop. And understanding silence as an action towards stopping, is something that's very difficult nowadays because the world goes so fast, the flow of information is accelerating. So every day stopping becomes a harder action to perform. And it even becomes a revolutionary act, right? And something that we have learned during these months of confinement in different places in the world, especially in cities, is that we never imagined what happened with the, I don't know, capitalism stopping. Like, what are the consequences of a system what was not even imagined to be able to stop for a few months and then being in silence and then being indoors and being forced to listen to ourselves, which is very difficult for many people right now, right? Like, you see people going on walks and hikes and headphones listening to music instead of listening at sounds, right? So it's hard, and I think it's very important to stop and before even thinking about taking action. So I think it's related to that. Thank you.
Oh, I like this. I like this point that you're saying in which you're now talking about silence, as I understand what you said, you're talking about silence not just as a quality of the sound, but as kind of a condition of action. If you don't make space for people to reflect or to pause or to stop what they're currently doing, how can they do something new if they can't stop what they're currently doing?
Exactly.
Do other people have thoughts on this in terms of, it might not just be silence, but what are the things that are critical for a sound experience, if that sound experience is going to result in people taking action afterwards?
May I ask something?
Please.
To the group, which is puzzling me. I mean, there's such a deep history of sound-provoking action. When you go back to, thinking of church bells, factory bells, the call to prayer, and we have, Pavlov's bell. So we have this really profound history of human behavior being conditioned and triggered by different sounds, and there's a deep cultural awareness of this. But when it comes to positive engagement for the environment, where is the research? What is going on in terms of at the neuroscientific level or the behavioral psychology level? How are we grappling with this question of how this powerful connection people have with sound in triggering behavior, how that can actually trigger powerful action to support the ecosystems that we live in? Is this something that anyone on the panel has experience of? Because this is such a wonderful panel of sound experts that I'd be fascinated to know if there are people researching this at the moment in terms of catalyzing people to engage with the environment.
Leah?
I see a couple of hands.
Yeah.
Bernie and Leah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, certainly some of the projects I've been involved with, river listening, biosphere soundscapes, where we're sort of looking at that intersection of art and science. And yes, there's these creative outcomes, these sound works that we're using as a way to develop a wider attention and awareness to what's actually happening in these ecosystems. But I often find the most successful elements of the projects are the community engagement and the participatory experiences. So actually bringing the community into those field recording expeditions and workshops. And we're at a point now where this field of bioacoustics and ecoacoustics, when we're looking more at, the idea of sound as a measure for environmental health, the kind of technologies that we need to be able to scale this globally are increasingly accessible and affordable. They're gaining more and more respect in scientific disciplines as non-invasive and, getting incredible amounts of acoustic data from environments. But I think by bringing citizen scientists and community members into these projects, giving these technologies to community members and actively listening in the field, when someone's there in the field and puts hydrophones into a river system and is suddenly exposed to this world of sound. I mean, we've had, multiple examples where being part of the process, that sort of participatory process, has had such a positive impact on people wanting to then take action and engage directly with conservation. But it's rarely been as a result of engaging purely with the resulting artistic experience. It's been much more bringing communities into the project from the field recording to the delivery of the project itself. And that's often, in augmented reality installations as well, where the sounds are planted back along the river system. Live streaming as well, the incredible work that Grant's been doing with SoundCamp and the Reveille project, really allowing communities to be part of that process. I've certainly observed has resulted in that engagement in conservation and environmental action.
Thanks. Thank you.
I think Julian had a thought and then Bernie had a thought as well. Oh, you're on mute, Julian.
Sorry, my thought is it starts with children. I mean, I've been talking for ages about the importance of teaching children to listen. We don't do it. They get taught to read and write, not to speak and listen. And I guarantee if you play Bernie's recording of a grieving badger to a class of 10-year-olds, you know, you'll get tears and you'll get engagement. And, you know, we start them at that age, and then we have people who grow up listening. So we don't have to radically transform people from being numb and deaf to all of this. That is where it all has to start. And I'm glad to say I know of 2 people in the world right now who are writing serious books about teaching listening, helping teachers to develop curricula and do this properly. So that's an exciting step from where I sit.
Who are the 2 people, if you may say?
I'll have to look their names up. I can't remember them right now, but they've both written to me, and I'm in communication with both of them. So I'm happy to connect any of you with them.
Thanks.
So Bernie, let me just bring in some thoughts from the YouTube viewers. There's a couple of thoughts that came in, and I'm not gonna, and then I'll give you the first chance to respond to them, Bernie, because I think it fits in. This is my paraphrase of kind of some of the questions that have come in. We've talked about natural sounds a lot. We've also talked about some engineered sounds, algorithmic sounds. And so there's some questions about at what point do you cross from a utopian vision where you can engineer sounds that make that can make people happy to sort of dystopian where you've gotten rid of the natural sound for, you know, algorithmic sound. Any thoughts on this? Because to me this feels applicable, because part of what we're talking about is trying to design a sound experience, but we're also often doing that with sort of natural sounds, which it's not necessarily our place to design. How do you operate in that tension? Bernie, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, one of the things that Julian and Leah and Michael John have been talking about, I think is really important, because we've kind of circled around this subject, but we've never quite got to the point. And this is a new subject. Bioacoustics, soundscape ecology, all of these issues are new subjects, maybe 20 years old now. And we need some time to define some of these terms and to hone them, so that when we're talking in a group like this, we all have some common expressions, so that we're talking about the same thing. And I think it would be really important to maybe, you know, to Julian's point, and 2 people are writing books on that. I have a book coming out also in the fall. It's The Power of Tranquility in a Very Noisy World. That's the title of the book. And it deals with all of these issues. And I think that it's really important to consider that and to add to this and to give us some time as a group, you know, to kind of push through these ideas and experiment with them and see how they work and how they fit over time.
This, you know, Nick, you have mentioned, as we've been working on this project, you've mentioned the term sound literacy, and how that frequently comes up in a very specific connotation, and you have an interest in expanding that. Is that along the lines of what
it's certainly not a term that I've coined, but it's a way that it's very similar to what you're saying, Bernie. You know, how do we describe the understanding aspects and you know, the topics within? And presently, sound literacy is applied to phonetics, but it's not so deeply defined. So I think there's an opportunity to define that term. You know, sound literacy being a way that we can have these kinds of conversations, maybe with a little bit more definition. And you know, there are a few things that are really interesting that I'm starting to see in this conversation. You know, even the definition of silence, you know, is that silence of human activity, or is that silence in general? And then, you know, then going back to sound literacy, you know, it is a point of understanding, and it's something that I think, might be a little bit more reserved at the moment for academic institutions or research, but a way that can be translated into the public is essential, I think, in for many of the things that we're talking about.
I really like this idea of continuing to push on our definitions. There's another question that came in from the YouTube viewers. Again, this is sort of my paraphrasing, but it talked about cultural sounds, and we've talked about natural sounds and we've talked about algorithmic sounds, but a viewer was asking about the role of cultural sounds, and I might come back to David, because you started the panel early in the panel. You described the sound of a camel dying, and a camel is not going to mean the same thing. A camel doesn't mean a person's livelihood in every culture. You have thoughts about cultural sounds?
Yeah, I was actually thinking, and I'll tie it back to what you were asking. If you want to communicate sound, there are a few things you need to understand. Like, you need to understand, like you're saying, the target audience. What does that particular sound mean to them? Is it a trigger? Is it a barrier? What feeling does it evoke? So that it's easier to tap into what people identify or associate a certain sound with, to get a certain action. For example, if you want to do, and I'm in radio production, so if I'm doing an ad or a public service announcement where I am trying to encourage people to save water, I'll probably run an ad where water is dripping, and just the sound of water dripping, I can then go into the messaging where I say, every day we lose a certain amount of water because we don't tighten our taps very well, and so this water could help someone in this community to go through, a whole day who doesn't have access to that water. So if you're trying to appeal to a certain culture, or to a certain, or to a certain culture, I think it's important to tap into what they identify as or what a certain sound means, because it could be that a certain sound of a bird means a bad thing. If you hear a certain sound, it means death, or it means, and if you use that sound to try and do a positive message, then you'll not get the effect that you want. So I think it's important to understand your target audience. It's important to know what emotion you want to get out of the messaging that you're giving out, and you'll get the right reaction if you use the right sounds for your messaging as well.
Well, we have just one more minute before we're up on the panel, and I think that's actually what you've sort of said at the end there about using the right sounds for the right, to get the right reactions. That's exactly what we're trying to figure out, and it's so much easier said than done. We don't know what the right sounds are. We don't know what the right reactions are. There's always unintended consequences when you try and drive people to action. And so this is the area that seems very rich to explore. Like Bernie said, it seems like something that's not going to be dissected and solved in a 90-minute panel. And our hope was not that we would solve it in this panel, but that we would start the conversation and maybe start to dive into the nuance of it. And I'm incredibly appreciative of all of your time in helping us do so. And I hope it will just be one of many conversations on this topic. So thank you for your time. And I really appreciate everybody's contribution and hope that we'll get to talk more about it in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.